Hey all, this is Mikro. I'm going to be going over some strong gem setups for the current patch depending on what role you're playing. There have been some key differences with the meta at this current patch. There have been bows that have been tending to slot more elemental oriented weapons and gems in their weapons in order to get around the range falloff, which have changed the meta from a light perspective in terms of what you need to run, as well as the Shirking Fort changes have made it so that Shirking Fort is very viable if you're going versus a lot of damage types, and is also viable for heavy people on point, I would say generally. But hopping right into this, if you are a long-range light player, I would say stick with 5 Elemental Aversion. I would do something like 2 Emeralds, 6 Opals, a Fire Amulet, and Flame Absorption pots. The main reason why the Emerald amount is lower here is bows are tending to slot elemental gems on their actual bows themselves. The reason why they're doing this is it gets around the range fall-off problem, so it allows them to actually do like higher normal damage. This is also allowing them to get around the problem that healers tend to have physical aversion, and bows are typically asked with healing for the backline as well as for healers. Kind of depending on the bow setup that people that you're versus, either this will be better or something more traditional with physical aversion, but it kind of depends on the bows and how caught up they are about that bug. Seems like a lot of the better bows are tending to use that bug to their advantage to try to do a little bit more damage, but if people aren't running this on your server, something more traditional with physical aversion may be better. In terms of close range splits, so if you're like a blunderbuss and you're a light player, I would say 5 elemental version is good. I'd do 5 onyx because you need to have some protection versus disruptors. I would do 3 opals because you need to have protection, some protection versus detonates, although that's like less common off a point than it is on point, and protection versus like general elemental damage. I would run a fire amulet and then do flame absorption pots. This comboed with elemental version will make you very tanky versus fire, which is the main source of damage off a point. That is elemental, as well as give you good enough resistance versus melees and dex players who are often doing the split strat that I talked about in order to maximize your survivability and that aspect of the game. The main thing is not getting too close to one matchup. Like, you want to make sure that you're not too close to melee with playing this sort of setup, or you will get blown up. But if you juggle the distances right, this will allow you to be generally more survivable than other setups. This is also a pretty good setup for OPR because it's just very common for light melees to be played in OPR, and 5 Onyx will help prevent a lot of the damage that comes through from that. If you're a medium edge of point player, I'd say 5 Shirking Fort is really good because that will work versus general incoming damage. I would do 2 Onyxes and 6 Opals to compensate for not having an elemental aversion. So you stack the Opals in order to make it so that you're more well-rounded in that aspect. You run a Fire Amulet, and then I would do Flame Absorption pots. This will allow you to be very tanky versus Fire Staff and Blunderbuss and detonates, while using the actual Shirking Fort itself to keep up with melees. This setup will make it so that if you are proccing Shirking Fort, you will be tankier than you would be normally with Elemental Aversion to things that would be incoming that are scary, but it will make you a little bit less tanky if you're not proccing that Shirking Fort. So you have to be really consistent about proccing that Shirking Fort when you need it for this to be good. That being said, usually when you're in a spot where people are coming at you and there's a lot of damage incoming, it's not very difficult to proc Shirking Fort just because there is damage coming at you from a ranged and melee perspective when you're off a point. So I'd say this is generally a good thing to do in that aspect, as well as it provides better coverage versus all the various types that will be facing. It's not uncommon for bruisers or IGVGs to be facing blunderbuss, bows, melees, and fire staffs all at the same time, and Shirking Fort is your best bet to cover your bases versus all of those. Especially because medium players tend to transform or transcend like what their role typically requires, and they turn into pseudo disruptors at times. If you're a medium player on point, I would change this a bit. I would go the 5 elemental aversion route because it would just be less likely to be stripped. There is another option where you could go Shrinking Fort, and I will talk about that in a second. But if you're going to go 5 elemental aversion route, then you do 4 opal, I do 4 onyx. This will be like the most tanky setup that you can basically have versus detonate pushes, which if you're on point, you're going to be hit by a lot of detonates, so it just makes sense to kind of stack that way. And I would do a fire amulet and flame absorption pots just for the anti blunderbuss and anti fire staff tech that is still very potent. The other option that you have if you're a medium player on point, I'd say is 5 Shirking Fort or 4 Shirking Fort, 1 Ellie. I think is also decent if you're like on point or near like very, very close to the edge of point. 6 opals, 2 onyxes, a fire amulet, and flame absorption pot. This is very similar to that other like edge of point setup that I had before. It's generally very good. I'd say it can struggle a little bit more versus the detonate pushes, but if you're able to consistently proc the Shirking Fort, this will be better than the first option. That being said, the first option will be very consistent. You don't really have to worry about if it's procced or not. So if you're someone that doesn't like to spam dodge a lot, you probably want to consider going to the first option if you're a medium player, but if you're someone that does dodge, then the second option may be better for you. They are relatively close in terms of damage mitigation. The main thing that differs is like the amount of coverage that you have. So if you are annoyed and you realize that the dots actually incoming are taking your HP for a lot, you probably want to consider going the Shirking Fort route because Elemental Aversion won't cover damage versus dots. Or if bows are trying to hit you on point, then Shirking Fort will help versus that. Elemental Aversion will generally not. So there is some aspects there where it's kind of metagamey in terms of what damage is incoming, and you have to swap between those sets depending on the circumstance. But if you're kind of the best way to look at this is looking at your deaths, see what you die to, and then adjust accordingly. If you have 8 deaths in the war and 6 of them are to detonates and 2 of them are to like melee players, you probably want to be teching more towards against the detonates. But if you are dying more to just straight up brawls versus melee players, then you probably want to be teching more versus the melee players. You can do this by either adjusting what perks you're running, or you could adjust the opal or onyx amount depending on what role you're playing. I say to go balance thing between on onyx versus like running moonstones now, because bruisers have been typically running more and more offensive capabilities with their warhammer as of late recent, and dropping less offensive capabilities in the Great Axe, which makes it so that you don't really want to just tech versus one or the other anymore, but you want to have general absorption to both. In terms of if you're a heavy player on point, I'd say 5 Shirking Fort is the way to go, just because it's just buffed so much in the current patch. I do 6 Opal, 2 Onyx, a Fire Amulet, and I would run Dust. Specifically why you'd run Dust is just to be a way to counter the actual incoming detonates. This will be a very strong setup for everything in the game, and heavy in general is just very, very strong right now with the recent patch, and by running Dust, you're enabling yourself to live versus detonate pushes, as well as tech versus every other matchup, and basically be strong versus every matchup in the game. I'd say this is like the most tanky way to kind of generally build a build right now, and you have to run heavy in order to fully utilize it. In medium, it's a little bit more debatable which way is better, but in heavy, I would say Shirking Fort is generally better, and playing for that fortify aspect of the game is just the way to go. If you are a tank player, like a one that runs Sword and Shield, the setup that you run is very similar to the last patch. The main reason why it differs is because you actually consistently hit the old Fortify cap with SNS, because there is no way to remove old Fortify anymore, and your shield gives you 30% old Fortify. So in order to compensate for this, I would go 5 Elemental Aversion, 4 Opal, 4 Onyx. This will, and then I would do a Slash Ward and a Fire Ward. This will basically get you to gem cap for the fire damage and for what do you call it? And for slash damage, which is mostly what you do with incoming damage on you as an SNS. And then I would also run Dust to help versus the detonates, just like the other heavy point build I recommended. I say Dust because you generally, if you're running Dust or Oak, you're saving it for when the actual crash happens. When the actual crash happens, you'll see people running at you. It's usually very telegraphed, and you have time to get the dust off before they detonate, and then that will save you a lot of the time. You typically on point don't need to worry as much about fire damage just killing you over time. You mostly die to just detonate pushes, and this is just a good way to attack against that in general. And that's it for this video, guys. I'll see you guys in the next one.